running backs in general and their value, and what that means going forward. Um, so let's just go ahead and dive into things, Austin.
Yeah, man. Doubleheader tonight, going live once again, hitting the people up. Yeah, 2024 free agent running backs tonight. It's an interesting class, man. It's an interesting discussion because they weren't highly valued. I think that's my number one
Mm.
takeaway from this. Like we're gonna look back on see what they did this past season and be like, well, what were we thinking? But there's just more nuance in the discussion, so that's what we're gonna try to bring tonight. A little nuance in this running back discussion, and yeah, man, it's interesting because 8 mil for Derrick Henry. I believe Saquon got a little bit more than that, but it's just like players that were the best at their position in the NFL basically went for peanuts this past offseason. And it worked out really well for some teams.
It did. And that opens up the conversation around, the decisions to let guys like that leave. And I think that's probably the thing we'll start on first with the Giants because, Joe Shane and, Mara, the owner, had that, clip that circulated from, the off-season series and basically saying, I'm going to be hurt if Saquon leaves. And, it gave us an insight into something we talked about around the draft with Travis Hunter of something owners care about is the face of the franchise, right? Having a guy that fans want to buy a jersey for, and even if things are going poorly, they want to show up and support. Um, and that played a huge role, I think, in the narrative around Saquon and whether or not the Giants should re-sign him. And, I know you and I both agree on this, but at the end of the day, the Giants made the right decision, in my opinion. They were not in a position to sign a running back to a long-term deal and pay them a ton of money when the situation was not, didn't set Saquon up to succeed. They drafted him second overall, which was aggressive back in 2018. But the roster was not good, and his last season in New York wasn't great from a statistical output perspective because the offensive line was so bad. And the narrative was, how did the Giants let their franchise player go?
That's been the narrative the whole time, man. Saquon runs for 2,000 yards, helps lead the Eagles to the Super Bowl, and now people are clowning the Giants. And it's just, here's the deal. It was a good decision for both teams. And that's where the nuance comes in because Saquon never runs for 2,000 yards with the Giants. We just saw how many years of sample size since 2018 of Saquon, 6 years of sample size with the Giants. He was never as good as he was last year. Last year was by far his most effective season. And it's because the Giants did not have the team around him, specifically the offensive line. The Giants' offensive line has been pretty much battling the Titans for the last few years for worse than the NFL. I mean, this has been one of the worst lines in the league for quite some time. And which is funny because we'll get into a former Titans running back here soon. Yeah, so like it didn't make sense for the Giants to give Saquon Barkley that money during this rebuild. It just did not make sense for them to do so because it would have been bad for Saquon and it wouldn't have made sense from the Giants' perspective either until they figure out their offensive line. But it did also make sense for the Eagles. Why did it make sense for the Eagles? Because they have a good offensive line. They have one of the top 5 offensive lines in the NFL. And I say top 5 generously. It's a top 2 offensive line. It's basically them and the Lions competing for the best offensive line in the league. So it made sense for the Eagles. And we saw what we saw last year because we have this as a title. This debate the last few years, really since PFF, honestly, PFF was a big part of this debate and analytics in football. Do running backs matter? And honestly, for a long time, I think we leaned on the side of you don't need to invest a lot in the running back position because it's so dependent on what's around it. And like a solid running back basically brings the same amount of impact as a elite running back. But I think what we saw this past season is people are still right that the running back position is heavily dependent on what's around it. But an elite running back in a elite situation can really elevate a team. And that's what we saw with the Eagles, in my opinion, with Saquon. We saw an elite running back come in and absolutely elevate a running game. He 100% elevated that offense and made them better last year and helped them win a Super Bowl. But Saquon is not going to be able to do that on a team like the Giants because they just aren't in the same position as the Eagles.
And yeah, completely agree with all of that. Like the narrative around the running back value is a nuanced one, right? Everything is always kind of absolutism now, where it's either fully in, fully out, fully agree, fully disagree, and everything is way more gray than that. And there's still proof in the pudding that you can draft running backs in the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth round and have a starter. I mean, look at what, besides before Christian McCaffrey went there, but even when he's been hurt, like the 49ers have been doing that for a while. You just rotate through running backs because if your team is good enough, your scheme is good enough, it doesn't really matter. But to your point, when you have a good offensive line and a good offense in general, taking an elite running back can change that. And there is still a tier, right? Like you can go get a good, an average to good running back pretty much wherever. But elite running backs are hard to find. And really right now in the NFL, CMC coming off of an injury, I would say in terms of true elite, it's Saquon and Derrick Henry. And then you may be able to start throwing like a Jahmyr Gibbs, Bijan starting to come up to that. But like last year, it was two. It was Saquon and Derrick Henry. And for the narrative side of it, the Eagles immediately winning a Super Bowl after doing that is going to push this idea in some ways for teams and fans to say, oh, if my team goes out and signs an elite running back, we're going to go win a Super Bowl. That's what it takes now to win a Super Bowl, signing an elite running back. When in reality, inserting an elite running back into a top two offensive line and just one of the, if not the best, it is the best roster in the NFL, elevates it. It takes you to a new level. And like we'll touch on Derrick Henry, it's a similar situation there. So I think, from both teams' perspectives, it was the right move. And it worked out well for Saquon and the team that signed him, which I think is the most important part of Saquon, right? Him re-signing with the Giants, even if he had gotten the money he was looking for, like who knows what his career looks like from here on out because of that situation. And I do empathize with Giants fans because I'm in a similar boat where a franchise guy, face of the franchise type player, leaves. But I also, root for that player more so and wanting to see them succeed. And it is tough to see your franchise player leave. And I understand from ownership's perspective and everything that you lost the guy who's bringing people into the stadium. You saw Saquon jerseys everywhere. Everybody had those throwback Giants Saquon jerseys. And it is tough. But from, a process perspective, they did the right thing, in my opinion.
They did, man. They did, because maybe in a few years, if they finally have one of those top tier offensive lines like the Eagles have had for so long, then they can go out and try to get their running back and invest more into that position. But my biggest takeaway from this class, and we'll talk about it with Derrick Henry in a second, is that you should not invest in an elite running back unless you have an elite situation around him, because that's the only way you're going to see the true impact of Saquon Barkley. Like Saquon Barkley, talent-wise, sure. Was he worth the second overall pick? Sure. Talent-wise, maybe he was, if you go back and redraft that draft. But that's the thing. That position in particular is so dependent on what's around it that you have to be careful about what you invest in it. Because, yes, is he a good player? Yes, but second overall pick, you're kind of depending on him to change the offense, right? You're depending on him to change it. And a running back cannot do that. A running back cannot do that. A running back to me is the perfect cherry on top. If you have a well-built offensive line, you have a well-established offense, you add that elite running back to it, and then, okay, you can go to the next level like we saw last year with the Eagles. And they did. That's the reality. They got a whole lot better because of Saquon Barkley. We saw the running game just kind of go through the roof, and we saw their offense improve greatly. And Saquon has a lot to do with that. So yes, running backs matter again, but it's not like in a sense that, okay, Saquon can just go make any team better, because he just can't.
And it's funny too, because, he was second overall. Derrick Henry was a second round draft pick. So even just finding that elite running back, also from a value perspective, doesn't mean you have to find them in the first round. Look at Kamara. Um, you can find elite running backs later rather than in the first round, and then the signing of them is kind of that decision afterwards. But and now here we are a year later. You know, Saquon just won Offensive Player of the Year. He probably doesn't win one of those if he stays with New York. Again, thinking about it from his perspective, he wins Offensive Player of the Year. He signed for about 12 million in average last offseason before 2024. He signed that extension, which is now worth 20 million a year. And again, that doesn't happen if he re-signs with the Giants. Like, it just doesn't.
Nope.
And so from his perspective,
dude, we could be looking at his career. I'm not saying his career would be over, but like with some of the way, like some of the seasons that took place with the Giants, the injuries, like the lack of production, like people would be questioning like if Saquon has anything left. That's how these discussions 100%. Happen. So yeah, dude, from Saquon's perspective, he literally could not have made a better decision. Like, I don't know if he left any money on the table, like with signing with a different team last offseason. But if he did, he made 100% the correct decision. He got a Super Bowl out of it, Offensive Player of the Year. And like you said, he just got this new contract that would have never happened if he didn't have a top 2 offensive line blocking for him.
He's now the highest paid running back in the NFL because of it. And to your point, his last season in New York, and he was healthy for pretty much all of it. He had less than 1,000 yards and averaged 3.9 yards per carry. This past season, he rushed for 2,000 because he joined an elite group of running backs on the all-time list and averaged 5.8. Like,
that's crazy. That's 2 more yards.
Two more yards. And and that's just what the situation can do. So, I again, beyond happy for Saquon because he's also just, seems like a good guy and everything and a good face for the league. And now the Madden cover as well. He also just got a Madden cover out of all this because of that backwards hurdle
play.
Yeah, which was ridiculous. So, yeah, I think, you and I kind of agree on that and the situation, how that all played out. And now we can kind of roll into the second guy, which is a little bit, near and dear to me, but
as a
Derrick
Titans
Henry.
Fan.
So much like Saquon, the narrative at the time, and I saw it a ton from all the Titans fans, was how could this team let this guy go? And I was on the rare side of this as Titans fans, I would say, because most of them wanted him to stay. Obviously, he's our guy. You make him retire as a Titan, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, it was just time for things to change for him. We had that tiny window where the Titans were arguably one of the best teams in the NFL, and he was elite, rushed for 2,000 yards, and then he had the injury, and the offensive line fell off an absolute cliff. And anybody who's watched Titans games, all the Will Levis memes from last year, and even the year before with Tannehill's collapse, like, the offensive line was atrocious, like bottom 2 in the NFL bad. And it showed with his stats. It showed. And so the Titans making the decision, at the end of the day, doing him a favor too, right? Like, I'm sure they wanted to keep him in that building, but at the end of the day, they said, you got to do what's best for you. And he went on to a situation that, again, he elevated an offense and kind of sparked back his career a little bit from it.
He did, man. It's a lot like the Saquon situation. This last year, to me, we weren't doing stop the takes at the time, but this is one of the more fascinating signings of last offseason. For one, they signed him for $8 million. So there's quite literally, like, from obviously $8 million would be a ton to us, but from an NFL, front office perspective, this is like nothing, right? Like, this is no risk whatsoever into this contract. So, and you add him to a backfield with Lamar Jackson, dude. I mean, it was a fascinating signing, and it literally worked out exactly how people thought, right? They were dominating in the run game last year, dude. They really could not be stopped last year in the run game. It's kind of was like why I was surprised. I thought the Ravens might go on a run, man, because like it felt like that was a winning formula, like especially in January to run the ball like they were. And I think from Derrick Henry's perspective, it was the offensive line. The offensive line's good. at Baltimore. It's not an elite offensive line like the
Right.
Eagles, but the difference there was again Lamar Jackson, because you add Lamar Jackson to that backfield, it opens things up for Derrick Henry in a way that really he's never seen in his career. Case in point, averaged the most yards per carry in his entire career. So it was one of those. It was one of those things, man. It was like, again, it didn't make a lot of sense for the Titans to re-sign him. It really didn't. Really the only way it would is kind of what you keep touching on, which is face of the franchise, which does matter, right? Like that, like Derrick Henry not being a Titan definitely impacted ticket sales last year. Like they were one of the
Oh yeah.
one of the, the teams that were struggling to bring people to the stadium last season. And I'm sure not having Derrick Henry had part to do with that. But listen, Derrick Henry was never rushing for 2,000 yards again behind that Titans offensive line. It was just not going to happen. And he wasn't going to be a part of this rebuild the Titans are trying to partake in. And he is obviously going to make a bigger impact for a team like the Ravens, who already have a good running game, who have a good offensive line, and who are ready to win now. So it just made sense from both parties' perspectives. And the Ravens got him on a really good deal because, again, like the value of running backs were really low last offseason. Plus, he was coming off one of his worst years in the league. He played all 17 games, but he just, he averaged one of his lowest average, I believe, in his career last season. So it wasn't a good year for Derrick Henry on paper. But if you look at, and I think you'll bring some of these advanced statistics, Dakota, if you look at some of the advanced statistics, it's like, okay, Derrick Henry can still play. Derrick Henry can still play. It's that Titans offensive line, man, that, like you said, was really just like really, really bad. Like top 2 worst offensive lines in the league bad.
Yeah, and to be honest, his career, like he's already over 30 and just had almost a 2,000-yard season, so he's kind of an anomaly from a running back age durability perspective, especially considering this stat, which is Derrick Henry is in a league of his own when it comes to yards after contact. So defined by the first time a defender makes contact with you in any way. And over his career, this guy has rushed for like 12,000 yards, and 9,000 of them have come after contact. So
unbelievable.
It's an absurd
Wow.
stat, and that's based on PFF stats because it's not. I don't think it's fully accurate from a rushing perspective, but that is absurd. And this past season, this is one of the key differences, though, when evaluating what he did with Baltimore versus Tennessee. Back in 2019, actually, let's even look 2019 and 2020, his 2 best seasons in Tennessee. He rushed for about 1,500 yards, and like 1,200 of that was after contact. And then when he rushed for 2,000, 1,500 of that was after contact. So like he was getting contacted very early and had to do all of that work on his own, which shows how good of a running back he is. Also shows how his durability, his career probably could end up lasting longer had he not. And then the stat that is just fascinating is his yards before contact per rush. Okay. So not yards after. This is how far into a run he got before he got hit by a defender. His last 3 seasons in Tennessee, in 2021, a 0.9, 22, 0.79, and then in 23, 0.85. That means he was getting hit in the backfield on average for his entire season. He was getting contacted. Or sorry, not the backfield, but like barely past the line of scrimmage. Wouldn't even make it a yard downfield.
Less than a yard into the open field.
Less than a yard. Like he is basically hitting the line of scrimmage and getting touched on average. And in in Baltimore this past season, 2.48. 2.4, by far the highest of his career.
That's unbelievable, man. I mean, you almost tripled his yards before contact this last season. I mean, again, it speaks to the Ravens offensive line and Lamar Jackson just opening it up for him. And that's why it didn't make sense for Tennessee to re-sign him, right? That's the reason. And you brought up durability. Derrick Henry is also an interesting case study going forward. And so far in his career, as far as durability is concerned, man, he has been, outside of that one season that ended early because of injury, he has been one of the most durable running backs in NFL. And we really didn't know what to expect coming into this last year, going to Baltimore, right? Like on paper, it looked good, right? I mean, it's Derrick Henry, Lamar Jackson, but how many times have we seen these things not work out, right? With older players hitting free agency and signing somewhere else, it doesn't work out all the time. So we didn't know what to expect, but like we're just got done saying, this might be like statistically his best career year, right? Like this might be his career year this late into his career, man. And he hasn't shown any sign to me that he's slowing down, right? He was still really good in the playoffs on the limited sample, and he was elite last season. So it's going to be interesting to see like when and if he falls off, right? He's just been an anomaly in so many ways at that position. And he's also an anomaly in the fact that like there's always been like this old adage that like running backs get better throughout the game. Like the later it goes into the game, they get better. Derrick Henry actually is that all the time, dude. Like in the fourth quarter, that's when he does his best work. So he's just fascinating from so many different perspectives, man. And another guy who elevated his team, right? He elevated the Baltimore Ravens. Their running game got better with Derrick Henry. So he absolutely matters, right? That like from a running back perspective, he absolutely made an impact and a difference, but he's only able to do that on the Ravens. He's only able to do that in a running situation that's already built around him, right? He with a good offensive line and Lamar Jackson. He's not going to do that with the Titans. That's why it made sense for both parties.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point about like not knowing what to expect, because with running backs and probably receivers are the two big where like when you hit 28 to 30 years old and you go sign somewhere, you never really know what's going to happen. And in recent years, we watched this, right? Todd Gurley, he went from like one of the best running backs in the NFL to gone instantly. Le'Veon Bell, same way. That happens all the time where running backs they leave in free agency, go sign somewhere, and then suddenly their career is over. So you really didn't know what to expect. Like he still looked good in Tennessee, but like, is he reaching that cliff? Is he going to fall off? And no, turns out the situation was just that bad in Tennessee that it was holding him back. Like at the end of the day, that's what was happening. And, now we get to see, hopefully, him play out, a few more years of his career and get to add to what has been, pretty much a Hall of Fame career that could have been hurt by being in a bad situation. And one thing I want to touch on with him too is that, the same thing's true for Saquon is your offensive coordinator. Like the offense you're in matters. The Giants were cycling through coaches and their offense was never good. When Derrick Henry had LaFleur and then when Derrick Henry had Arthur Smith, those were some of his best seasons in Tennessee. And then things kind of started to fall. He had one good season without them. But then that also played a role, I think, is when you don't have a great offensive mind or the scheme isn't as good, because then he goes to the Ravens with Todd Monken, who loves to run the ball and has a fantastic season alongside Lamar. So Derrick Henry's a bit of an anomaly in that aspect anyway, where his age was and what he ended up doing. And just like Saquon, it got him more money. He signed for $8 million a year, and now he doubled that. He signed a contract extension making 15. And looking at this, they've basically pushed all of that money off to 2027. So they're really not paying him a ton besides signing bonus right now. He'll make like $16 million in 2027 alone. But similar to Saquon, got a deal that was probably less than what most would have valued him at, even at his age. And then he turns around and makes more money because of how successful he was.
Yeah, man. Just another example of it. Running backs matter in certain situations. And an elite running back can elevate an already like good to an elite offense, and that's what happened with the Ravens this past season.
Absolutely. So, moving on, we'll chat through a few other people. So, last year's running back free agency class was ridiculous. Guys like, guys we won't touch on here much, but even the Devin Singletary, Antonio Gibson, Austin Eckler, Zach Moss. J.K. Dobbins is worth noting. He was having a good season before he got injured. A couple other bigger names that were like bigger signings would be Josh Jacobs, who got the biggest contract of all these running backs, who got signed by far nobody got a 4-year deal. He's the only one that got a 4-year deal for $12 million a year. And much like the other two, immediately has the best season of his career.
Honestly, that 4-year deal for $12 million is starting to look pretty good for the Packers, considering Saquon and Derrick Henry signed similar deals and have already re-signed for 20 mil plus a season. Yeah, Josh Jacobs had a really good year last year, man. And I think this running back class in general, because you just listed off all those names, it kind of tells me that it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense to sign a running back to a second contract, because you're going to be playing a premium most of the time when you can usually just hit free agency and go find a pretty good option. Especially in this class, like you said, it was a loaded free agency running back class. Josh Jacobs, I don't think he elevated the Packers to an extreme degree like Saquon and Derrick Henry did, but I think he did elevate their running game. I think they found their running back of the future, and it was also kind of confusing because a lot of people are like, why let Aaron Jones go and then go get a guy like Josh Jacobs, who was not coming off a very good year. And I think people were kind of like, Josh Jacobs had the one good season before going to Green Bay. At least in my mind, to me, I didn't consider Josh Jacobs one of the elite running backs in the NFL. I just didn't consider him that. This past season, though, he absolutely was, dude. He was arguably a top 5 running back in the entire league. So he had a really good year.
Yeah, he was. And I'll correct what I said a little bit. He didn't have his best. He did have the most rushing touchdowns he's had this season, but rushing yards wise and yards per carry, it wasn't his best, but one of his best. And yeah, it's also fascinating because of how old a lot of these running backs were in this class. A lot of them are now pushing 30. Aaron Jones just hit 30. He's another guy you just mentioned that they lost, who then the Vikings signed, who immediately had a pretty good season with them as well. Josh Jacobs is now 27. He was 26 when they signed him. So, kind of justifying that 4-year deal that you're basically going to get him to that point where he hits 30. But yeah, another interesting one where it did feel like from the Packers perspective is a little weird, where you let Aaron Jones walk, but then you replace him and you get a bit younger there, but talent wise, I don't know if it was a drastic change. And clearly they want to invest in running back. From the Raiders perspective, it also made sense. Right. And now looking at it, it worked out. They've got Ashton Genty now. So they've got their future running back, but it didn't make sense to re-sign a guy like Josh Jacobs to a $12 million a year deal when you're in rebuild mode. Like, that's just something you should never do when your offensive line isn't that good and you're in a rebuild mode. Some other names on here, we already touched on Aaron Jones, and he had a pretty solid season for the Vikings. And then 2 others that I think are worth noting are DeAndre Swift, who's kind of been on this journey now. And I think his deal was one of the more interesting because he had a pretty good season in Philadelphia, his 1 year there. But then he turned that into a 3-year, $24 million deal. So he gets $8 million a year, which probably felt good for Chicago at the time that you're getting a running back. Now, a year later, we're like, draft season, everybody wanted them to take Ashton Genty. So you're kind of thinking,
Yeah, you're not super thrilled to have DeAndre Swift now. Especially, that was a team, Dakota, not just Ashton Genty, we were mocking them, but also second-round running backs, right? A lot of people expected them to
People wanted to give him Hampton at 10.
Exactly. Yeah, true. Or Amari Hampton at 10. But they also had 2 second-round picks, and people expected fully that they would use one of those second-round picks on a running back. They decided to go a different direction. They now hired Ben Johnson, who kind of is responsible for the benching of DeAndre Swift. So we'll see how long he lasts as a Bear and how long he lasts as the starter. But yeah, he was more interesting one. He's kind of a guy that's, he's been okay. He's kind of like an example of, if you don't have an elite offensive line, and the Bears don't yet, now they're kind of, they're getting better, but it's not elite, then go out and get a guy like DeAndre Swift. He makes sense in a situation like that. It wouldn't make sense for the Bears, especially last offseason, to go and invest in a guy like Saquon or go and invest in a guy like Derrick Henry, because you just don't have the offensive line for it yet. So getting a guy like Swift in their case made a lot more sense to me.
And I think it kind of shows this line of what we were talking about around the fact that there really are only 2 elite running backs, in my opinion, in the NFL right now. Getting last year, the Ravens getting Derrick Henry for the same price that the Bears got DeAndre Swift for felt pretty good, especially after how their last seasons went, where Derrick Henry now gets an extension, and the Bears are basically desperately trying to move on from DeAndre Swift. So
Yeah.
this class is fascinating from top to bottom in terms of like value of running back and like the tiering of running backs and how that middle pack is pretty much interchangeable. Like if you can go get a guy for cheaper or draft a running back in the third round and your team's not in a great position to go try to win and have an elite situation for running back, you should always be doing that. You should be drafting running backs in the third or later, almost every year, every other year, probably, to just have guys to be cycling through there. The last name I'll mention close to home too was Tony Pollard, because I think he was probably one of the more surprising signings in terms of what he got. Because, he really was only a starter for like a season for Dallas. Wasn't there and was already kind of up there in age because he had played, behind Zeke for a while. But the Titans got him for $7 million a year, which felt okay. But, we then kind of immediately saw, the other side of the Derrick Henry thing, where you then insert Tony Pollard into a poor offensive line with the Titans, and he played well, but the situation was so bad he wasn't able to elevate or really change the offense for the Titans much.
Which would have been the case with Derrick Henry as well. And that's not to compare Derrick Henry and Tony Pollard, because that's two different players, but it speaks to the same idea that if you don't have the offensive line around a running back, they're just not going to be effective. No matter who it is, whether it's Derrick Henry, Saquon Barkley, which we just got done talking about how those are the two elite running backs in the NFL, or at least on a consistent basis. So, yeah, man. I mean, overall, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, yes, running backs matter, but it depends on the situation, right? It depends on the situation you're in, because if you're the Giants or if you're the Patriots, like these teams that still, or even still the Titans, that don't have the offensive line yet, they don't have an elite offensive line, nowhere close to that. They don't even have an average offensive line. It would make absolutely no sense for that team to invest a lot in the running back position. That's why we still have the debate every year, Dakota. Would you take a running back in the top 10, or would you even take one in the first round? But particularly the top 10, where there's a reason you're drafting in the top 10. It's typically because you're not very good. And one of the reasons you might not be very good is because you don't have a good offensive line. Now, the Raiders just got done doing that with Ashton Jeanty. I think they're in an interesting spot where I think their offensive line is average or maybe slightly below average. So it's not like he's going into a situation like the Titans or the Giants the last few years where it's just going to be a complete train wreck, which is good for Jeanty. But that's why you have those questions, right? Not that Ashton Jeanty's not a good player, right? He's an elite player. He's an elite prospect, but he plays a position that's heavily reliant on other positions, 5 other positions, the offensive line, and really the offensive line, or the offense in general, like you touched on earlier with offensive coordinators, because we're talking about elite running backs right now. And I was thinking like, well, Jahmyr Gibbs, but you can't really put Gibbs in that category yet because of Ben Johnson. Yeah. Like you have to see him do it without Ben Johnson. So again, you have to have the offense around the running back, and more so than any other position, right? Like a left tackle can flourish in pretty much any offense. And not that it's a good scheme, not that the offense in general is going to be successful, but like individually they can flourish. Individually, a receiver can flourish, and definitely a quarterback can obviously flourish. But a running back individually cannot flourish without the offense around him.
100%. And it kind of goes back to, when I touched on the running backs falling off a cliff thing. And in some situations, it's where running backs went and chased money with teams that weren't great, right? Like Le'Veon going to the Jets.
Yeah.
Had he gone somewhere else with a better situation, he may have played for a little bit longer. So, yeah, I love that. Honestly, this was such a fascinating, offseason last year and how things played out around the running back discourse. Because in my opinion, I think it gets us closer to, what PFF has talked about and what a lot of the, analytics nerds or whatever have talked about, which is that, running backs, the majority of running backs don't matter in the sense that they're rather relatively interchangeable. It's not even so much that they don't matter, it's that they're not going to elevate an offense if the offensive line isn't good. But what this was the perfect use case of is showing that. I think some people are going to interpret this class as, you need an elite running back to succeed, or you should go get those good running backs. But it actually showed the fact that if your offensive line is not good, running backs aren't going to flourish. If your offensive line is good and you have a good offensive system, they will, and they will elevate your team. And I think that this was the perfect example of all of that. So, a fascinating situation, and may have impacted some value stuff. People interpret things differently, but Genty going sixth overall, Marion Hampton going into the first round, some people are going to interpret it as I need a better running back. So,
very good point. And I will also say one point we haven't touched on yet, which we should. These things fluctuate. Running backs
right.
value will fluctuate depending on defenses, right? We saw this past season more too high, more teams trying to take away the deep ball and focus on stopping the pass game. Well, when that happens, it's going to slow the game down, and then all of a sudden running the ball matters more. So these things, it's not like definitively running backs have never mattered in football. There was a certain time where you could argue the running back was one of the more important positions in the NFL. But I will say there's never been a time where the offensive line play does not impact a running back. That's just a fact. That's always been the case. That's why a lot of people think Emmitt Smith's a top 5 running back ever. That's another discussion for another day because his offensive line elevated him. But the point is that these things can fluctuate, man. And I think you saw that. I think that was a combination of, like we're saying, these elite running backs went to elite situations, but also defenses around the league have been changing.
Yep. That's a really good point because it's true. Like in 2023 as well showed the beginning of that. I think when we saw passing stats just take a kind of fell off a cliff, right? Like, our MVP
for a couple of years.
It has, and last year was kind of a big symbol of that when we had the MVP only threw for like 24 or 25 touchdown passes. Like the league has shifted a little bit, and it is due to the too high thing where a lot of offenses are frustrated and quarterbacks are frustrated with that. And it's taking away some of the excitement from the game. But how do you combat that? You pound the rock with a guy like Saquon or Derrick Henry behind your elite offensive line. So I do wonder if, what Ben Johnson just did in Chicago as well, if there is going to be a philosophy switch because of this where let's go build an elite offensive line and then let's plug in a guy behind him that, can change the game. So it's going to be fascinating to see the NFL evolve and how this offseason may play a role in that.
And the Bears are interesting. We talked about the Bears a lot this offseason because they're one of the more interesting teams, I think, this offseason because they're doing it in the right order. That's the thing. They're doing it on the right order. They didn't go try to trade up for Ashton Genty and take the elite running back. They're saying, okay, before we go out and get our guy, because no question about it, Dakota, at some point they're going to target a guy. Before they do that, they're saying, okay, we need to go rebuild our offensive line. And I think it will work, man. What the moves they made this past offseason, they're young tackles. It's looking like that offensive line could become one of the better ones in the league. And then at that point, then you go get your elite running back weapon for Ben Johnson to work with, like he had in Detroit with Jahmyr Gibbs. And, and then maybe that offense will take the next step.
100%. And got to at least just shout out the other example of this that happened recently via trade, but was Christian McCaffrey. When he went to San Fran, he did elevate them, right? Like I just talked about how they were drafting running backs. They could plug an Elijah Mitchell in there and look good. But Christian McCaffrey elevated that team because they had a good situation, a good offensive scheme, and a good offensive line. So those examples are piling up now. But one of the more interesting things I think that this just discussion has done for me, though, is thinking about the future state of the NFL from a running back tier perspective and how many elite running backs there really are. Because it does feel like there's a lot of good and really good running backs, but in terms of elite, that they may be harder to find now.
It's also, you also brought up an interesting point earlier to go to about career discussions because like a lot of Derrick Henry's career statistics and Saquon's will be hurt by their poor situations that they were in for so long. And how will that impact them as far as a career discussion is concerned? That's the kind of nuance that should enter running back all-time discussions because, I mean, we've talked about this before, Barry Sanders, all those Lions teams, they didn't have the best team around him, and he was already the greatest ever with that bad team around him. So how good would he have been with a good team?
My gosh.
How good would he have been with the Dallas Cowboys offensive line that Emmitt was running behind? So it is a fascinating thing to think about, man, that and we didn't really get to see. We really didn't get to see Saquon Barkley's true form until he got the opportunity to run behind the Eagles offensive line, which is a fascinating thing to think about it. Like how many guys have been like better than they really are, but because their situations are bad and we're just never going to get to see that out of them. And you're right. The Christian McCaffrey example is a great example of that because again, an elite player who was on an offense that he could not make an impact on in Carolina because they did not have a good team around him. He goes to an offense that he can make an impact on, and he did. He elevated that offense and helped them get to a Super Bowl and all that. So, yeah, man, it's been happening more and more, and I think we will continue to see it, man.
And it is sad to think that Saquon got unlocked 7 years into his career. That is a depressing thing to think about. As just a fan of the league and watching, his career play out. And it's going to suck when we have, the people who just box score watch, look at statistics as their main source, basic statistics, not advanced analytics and things like that when evaluating these guys later on. Because, yeah, there is that nuance of what Saquon dealt with his first 6 seasons in the league and what Derrick Henry did for his first 8 years in the league. And that's where PFF, whether you like what they do or not, adds some layer to this where, Derrick Henry just had an elite, he led the league in his PFF grade, meaning he just played the best he did. Josh Jacobs, Derrick Henry, and Saquon, all three had the highest graded highest graded seasons of their career this past season. So those are the things that I think matter too, that need to go into those discussions. And that yards before contact thing for Derrick Henry. We're going to be looking at something like that in 10 years and then look at his yards after contact stat. People are going to be like, how did Derrick Henry do it?
That's one of the most absurd statistics I've ever heard. Like you almost have to, there needs to be an adjustment to stats, to running back stats to truly give Derrick Henry credit for those Tennessee years where he was still really good. It just didn't look good on paper. It just didn't look good from a statistical perspective, or at least it didn't look elite from a statistical perspective in some of those seasons because he just didn't have the O-line.
100%. Wanted to touch just briefly to end this because what's funny is we just talked about this elite class of 2024 and then kind of comparing it to 2025 where it was the complete opposite because all of those guys were free agents at the same time. The biggest contract handed out was Najee Harris's $5.25 million a year for 1 year.
Wow.
Only a couple guys got 2 years deals. It's because everybody just got they were all part of that class. But it is interesting the waves that this happens in, and I don't know.
It was a loaded draft class, though. That's the thing. It was a loaded running back draft class. So see how that plays out. How many of those guys get second contracts? Because we've seen a lot of elite running backs at this point who were good during their rookie deals not get second contracts. Obviously Saquon being the latest example of that.
100%. So it'd be fascinating to see how the narrative around running backs and the way the league specifically values them as this kind of shift where the defenses with the too high scheme consistently taking away the passing game and how it has encouraged offenses to run the ball more. So going to be fascinating to watch play out. Any closing thoughts?
No, man. I'm just kind of like you're saying, I'm interested to see how it goes going forward because these things fluctuate, man. We might come to you in a year from now being running backs matter more than quarterbacks now. Probably not, likely not, but you never know, man. You just never know how the NFL changes and how it fluctuates year to year. And it's going to be interesting to see how it continues to play out.
Absolutely. Appreciate everybody for tuning in, or if you watched this video, please like, share, subscribe, send it to your friends, leave a comment, let us know what you thought about those running backs last year and their seasons, in 2024 and how things look, as the NFL evolves going forward. Love to hear and see your all's thoughts. Appreciate everybody for tuning in, and until next time.
Thanks for talking ball with us.